Confined spaces, such as pits, manholes, and crawl spaces, are not designed for continuous occupancy and can be very difficult to exit in the event of an emergency. Construction workers often perform tasks in confined spaces and can face life-threatening hazards, including toxic substances, electrocutions, explosions, and asphyxiation. These hazards can largely be prevented if addressed prior to entering the space to perform work. This program is designed to assist employers and employees in understanding the requirements for practices and procedures to protect employees engaged in construction activities at a work site with one or more confined spaces, and will cover the following: OSHA standards, general requirements, hazards of confined spaces, permit required confined spaces, training, duties of authorized entrance, duties of attendants, duties of entry supervisors, emergency rescue, personal protective equipment. If employees are engaged in both construction and general industry work, OSHA compliance for confined spaces will be met if they follow the requirements of the construction regulation 29 CFR 1926 subpart AA. In situations where the confined space in construction standard is applicable and another regulation which addresses a confined space hazard is also applicable, employers must comply with both. OSHA defines a confined space as an area large enough and so configured that an employee can fully enter and perform assigned work, and has limited or restricted means for entry or exit, and is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. A confined space is not limited to small areas such as manholes, crawl spaces, and ditches, but includes larger areas such as tanks, vessels, and silos. Confined spaces require a permit if they have the potential for a serious safety or health hazard. A permit-required confined space, or permit space, is a confined space that may have a hazardous atmosphere, engulfment hazard, or other serious hazard, such as exposed wiring that can interfere with a worker's ability to leave the space without assistance. Only workers who have been assigned and trained to work in a permit space may do so. Before workers can enter a permit space, the employer has to write a permit that specifies what safety measures must be taken and who is allowed to enter the space. Before work begins at a work site, each employer must ensure a competent person identifies all confined spaces in which one or more of the employees it directs may work, and identifies each space that is a permit space through evaluation of the elements of that space, including necessary testing. If a workplace contains permit spaces, the employer who identifies or receives notice of a permit space must inform exposed employees by posting a danger sign or by any other equally effective means of the existence and location of and dangers posed by the permit space. A sign reading "Danger, Permit Required, Confined Space, Do Not Enter" would suffice. The employer must also inform its employees' authorized representatives and the controlling contractor of the existence and location of and dangers posed by each permit space. Employers who identify or receive notice of a permit space and do not authorize employees they direct to work in that space must take effective measures to prevent those employees from entering that permit space. If employees will enter a permit space, employers must have a written permit space program at the work site. The written program must be made available prior to and during entry operations for inspection by employees and their authorized representatives. OSHA does allow for employers to use an alternative method for entering a permit space under very specific conditions. Consult OSHA's CFR 1926.1203E1 for more information. Before an employee enters a permit space, the internal atmosphere must be tested with an instrument that detects oxygen content, flammable gases, and vapors and potential toxic air contaminants. Confined spaces can possess multiple hazards. A permit-required confined space means a confined space has one or more of the following characteristics. Contains or has a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Potential for engulfing. Trapping or asphyxiation configuration, or contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Hazardous atmospheres. The atmosphere of a confined space can prevent escape without help and cause illness, incapacitation, impairment, or even death. There are three types of hazardous atmospheres: oxygen deficient, flammable, toxic. Oxygen deficiency is when the space does not have sufficient oxygen to breathe. Impaired judgment, unconsciousness, and even death can occur. Oxygen is safe when it is between 19.5% and 23.5%. Never enter a confined space unless the oxygen in the space is sufficient. If needed, wear a supplied air respirator to provide fresh air. The confined space may contain flammable gases, vapors, mists, or dusts. The risks of a fire may not be obvious, and only testing can show if it contains traces of flammable substances. The substances can be ignited by smoking, grinding, welding, or metal friction. The atmosphere could be toxic to inhale. Inhaling just a small amount of some substances can cause irritation to the respiratory or nervous system. If a substance exceeds its permissible exposure limit, it could cause illness or death. Some common substances found in confined spaces include carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and sulfur dioxide. Dizziness, drowsiness, nausea, or headaches are good signs that the confined space should be evacuated immediately. Engulfing potential. Another hazard a confined space may have is the potential for engulfment. Engulfment is when an employee is trapped, buried, or smothered by liquid or flowing solids, such as grain or sand. Even if the material doesn't cover the head, the pressure on the chest can be enough to prevent breathing or damage internal organs. Trapping or asphyxiation configuration. Some confined spaces have an entrapping design. Employees can be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section. Other serious safety or health hazards. Confined spaces may also contain physical hazards such as moving machinery parts, buildup of heat, falls from exit-entry ladders, noise from machinery, and electrocution from live wires. OSHA requires a written entry permit program be developed and implemented before entering a permit-required confined space. The program should be made available for inspection by employees and their authorized representatives. Each entry employer must implement necessary measures to prevent unauthorized entry. Identify and evaluate hazards of the permit space before employees enter them. Develop and implement procedures and practices necessary for safe permit space entry operations. This includes specifying acceptable entry conditions and providing an opportunity for authorized entrants to observe any monitoring or testing of permit spaces. The procedures and practices must also isolate the permit space and physical hazards within the space. Eliminate or control atmospheric hazards. Ensure the monitoring procedures will detect an increase in atmospheric hazard levels in sufficient time for the entrants to safely exit the permit space should the ventilation system stop working. Ensure employees are not allowed to enter into or remain in a permit space with a hazardous atmosphere unless PPE is provided for each employee in the permit space, and the PPE will provide effective protection. And eliminate any condition, such as high pressure, that could make it unsafe to remove an entrance cover. Entry employers must provide and maintain, at no cost to the employee, the necessary equipment for safe entry into and rescue from permit spaces. Employers must ensure that employees use this equipment properly. Equipment includes, but isn't limited to, testing and monitoring equipment, ventilating equipment, communications equipment, PPE, approved lighting equipment, barriers and shields to protect against external hazards, equipment needed for safe entry and exit, rescue and emergency equipment, and any other equipment needed for safe entry, exit, and rescue from permit spaces. Conditions must be tested in the permit space to determine if acceptable entry conditions exist before changes to the space's natural ventilation are made and before entry is authorized to begin. If isolation of the space is infeasible because the space is large or is part of a continuous system, such as a sewer, pre-entry testing is required to the extent it is feasible before entry is authorized. If possible, entry conditions must be continuously monitored in the work area. If commercial equipment for continuous monitoring is not available, then periodic monitoring is allowed. An early warning system must be provided that monitors for non-isolated engulfment hazards. The system must alert entrants and attendants in sufficient time for safe exit from the space. Atmospheric hazards must be continuously monitored for acceptable entry conditions during entry operations. If commercial equipment for continuous monitoring is not available, then periodic monitoring of sufficient frequency is allowed. When testing for atmospheric hazards, test first for oxygen, then for combustible gases and vapors, and then for toxic gases and vapors. Employers must provide authorized entrant the opportunity to observe the pre-entry and subsequent testing or monitoring of permit spaces. Re-evaluation of the permit space is required if requested by an entrant who has reason to believe the evaluation of the space may not have been adequate. Test results must immediately be provided to each authorized entrant. The company needs to designate persons who have active roles in entry operations. The duties for each of these employees must be identified and training must be provided. They must also develop and implement procedures for summoning rescue and emergency services, including develop and implement system for the preparation, issuance, use, and cancellation of entry permits, including the safe termination of entry operations under both planned and emergency conditions. Develop and implement procedures to coordinate entry operations in consultation with the controlling contractor when employees of more than one employer are working simultaneously in a permit space or elsewhere on the work site, so that employees of one employer do not endanger the employees of another employer. Develop and implement procedures necessary for concluding the entry. Review entry operations when the employer has reason to believe the measures taken under the permit space program may not protect employees, and revise the program to correct deficiencies found to exist before subsequent entries are authorized. Before entry is authorized, each entry employer must prepare and post an entry permit at the entrance of a permit-required confined space. It is important for the authorized entrant, attendant, and entry supervisor to read the permit before working in or around the space. The entry supervisor must terminate entry and take the following action when any of the following apply. Cancel the entry permit when the entry permit operations have been completed, or suspend or cancel the entry permit and fully reassess the space before allowing re-entry when a condition that is not allowed under the entry permit arises in or near the permit space. and that condition is temporary in nature and does not change the configuration of the space or create any new hazards within it. And cancel the entry permit when a condition that is not allowed under the entry permit arises in or near the permit space. If the condition is temporary, it may be possible to suspend the permit to reassess the space and allow re-entry as stated previously. Any problems encountered during the entry operation must be noted on the permit. Permits must be retained for at least 1 year and used to review the program within 1 year of the permit entry. The program should be revised as necessary to ensure employees participating in entry operations are protected from permit space hazards. Employers may perform a single annual review covering all entries performed during a 12-month period. Entry permits must identify the space to be entered and the purpose, the date and length of time the permit is valid, the names of the authorized entrants, means of detecting an increase in atmospheric hazard levels in the event the ventilation system stops working, the personnel serving as attendant and current entry supervisor, the signature or initials of each entry supervisor who authorizes entry, the hazards of the permit space, the measures used to isolate the permit space and eliminate or control the hazards before entry, the acceptable entry conditions, results of initial and periodic tests performed, the rescue and emergency services that can be summoned and the means for contacting those services, the methods to maintain communications between the authorized entrants and attendants, equipment needed to perform the tasks such as PPE, testing equipment, communications equipment, alarm systems, and rescue gear. Any other information necessary, given the circumstances of the particular confined space, to ensure employee safety, and any additional permits required to perform work in the permit space, such as welding. Training plays a very important part of safety in confined spaces. Each employer is mandated to maintain a safe working environment. Employers must ensure that all authorized entrants understand the hazards in the permit space and the proper methods used to isolate, control, or in other ways protect employees from these hazards. It is important that employees not authorized to perform entry rescues be versed in the dangers of attempting such rescues. Training must establish employee proficiency in the duties required and must introduce new or revised procedures as necessary. OSHA requires employers to provide training in both a language and vocabulary that the employee can understand before assigning duties to employees pertaining to permit spaces, before changing employees' duties, when the permit space has new hazards, when the procedures change for the permit space, or when it is evident that an employee needs additional training. An employee who is authorized by the employer to enter a permit space, authorized entrants must know the hazards they may face during entry and how to properly use equipment required for entry. They must also maintain communication with the attendant in case of exposure to a hazard, and be able to alert the attendant when any warning signs of a dangerous situation or prohibited condition is recognized. Authorized entrants must exit from the permit space when the attendant orders an evacuation of the confined space, any warning signs of a hazard are recognized, a prohibited condition is discovered, or the evacuation alarm is activated. Employers need to provide at least one attendant outside the permit space to monitor the authorized entrance for the duration of the entry operations. Attendants may be assigned to more than one permit space. If attendant is monitoring more than one space, employers must include in the permit the means and procedures to enable the attendant to respond to an emergency affecting one or more of the monitored spaces. Attendants must know the hazards and potential hazards of the confined space and the behavioral effects of those hazards. Know how many authorized entrants are in a confined space and be able to identify each one. Remain outside the permit space during entry operations until relieved by another attendant. Continuously monitor and maintain communication with the entrants about the hazards that could be presented inside and outside the space. And contact rescue services as soon as they determine an entrant needs assistance with escaping. Warn unauthorized persons to stay clear of the confined space and advise the person to exit immediately if they have entered the permit space area. The attendant must then inform the entry supervisor and authorized entrants if any unauthorized person has entered the permit space. Be able to perform non-entry rescues as specified in your employer's rescue procedures, and not perform any additional duties that could interfere with the primary duty to monitor and protect the authorized entrants. There must be an entry supervisor for each permit-required confined space. The entry supervisor can monitor more than one space at a time. The duties of an entry supervisor include knowing the hazards of each confined space they supervise, including the mode, symptoms, and consequences of the exposure. Verifying that the proper entries have been made, as well as all the proper tests have been performed, and that all procedures and equipment required are in place and ready to use. Terminating the entry and canceling or suspending the permit. Confirming rescue services are available and the means for summoning them are operable. Confirming with the rescue service that they will notify the employer as soon as the rescue services become unavailable. Removing unauthorized individuals who enter or attempt to enter the permit space during entry operations. And determining entry operations remain consistent with terms of the entry permit and that the acceptable entry conditions are maintained. Emergency rescue service must be available and be able to respond in a timely manner. In the event the rescue service becomes unavailable, they must notify the employer immediately. Employee safety is a major concern during confined space entry. Emergency rescue should only be attempted by trained professionals, as deaths often occur during rescue attempts by fellow employees. The rescue service is to close off the area, get authorized entrants out of the space, and perform first aid as needed. Non-entry rescue is required unless the retrieval equipment would increase the overall risk of entry or would not contribute to the rescue of the entrant. A retrieval system or method must be used when non-entry rescue is selected. Emergency services must be confirmed and available in the event a non-entry rescue fails. The retrieval equipment must be in place before employees enter the permit space and allow for immediate rescue to begin as soon as rescue becomes necessary. One of the most important components of PPE in a confined space is a respirator. It is important employees understand the difference between various respirators and are using the proper one for the space and hazards associated with the space. It is important to fit test each piece of PPE. If a respirator is too loose or tight, it may allow toxins to be inhaled. A good fit feels secure around the chin, doesn't pinch the nose, doesn't slip, and allows the head to move. The respirator should be inspected before each use to make sure there are no cracks, holes, signs of wear, or loose connections. Respirators should be cleaned after each use. If a respirator is not cleaned or stored properly, it may not be capable of protecting the next wearer. Check with your employer about your company's respirator safety program and make sure you have been properly trained on the use of respirators. Other forms of PPE can include hard hats, safety glasses, clothing that protects the torso against chemicals, fires, and other hazards, as well as gloves and safety shoes that protect the hands and feet from various hazards. Confined spaces in the construction industry are a common hazard to workers and must be taken seriously. Never enter a confined space unless you are authorized to do so, and always have the proper PPE to enter the space. The OSHA mandates have been designed to serve as a guideline for employers and employees to follow prior to, during, and after entry into a confined space. Your training is important to your well-being, so take it seriously. It could save a life.